It was supposed to be just another evening. Florida State Attorney Aramis Ayala, the first black woman ever elected to that position in Florida, was driving home after a long day of work. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the city lights were starting to glow. Her car, a perfectly ordinary, legally registered vehicle, rolled smoothly through the streets. No speeding, no sudden turns, nothing unusual at all. Then, out of nowhere, she saw them. Flashing red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. If you've ever been pulled over, you know that sinking feeling in your stomach. For Ayala, it was no different, but something about this stop immediately felt off. She hadn't broken any laws. She hadn't even come close. Yet, here she was pulling over to the side of the road, heart steady but mind racing with questions. Why me? The officers approached slowly, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they walked toward her window. One stood slightly behind the other, a familiar formation meant to establish control. Ayala rolled her window down and greeted them calmly, her voice professional, her expression unreadable. "Good evening, ma'am," one of the officers began. "Can I see your license, please?" She handed it over without hesitation. No sudden movements, no arguments, just quiet compliance. But then came the question that anyone in her position would ask. "What's the reason I was stopped?" That's when things got strange. The officer paused, almost like he hadn't expected her to ask. He glanced at his partner, then back at her. We ran your plates," he finally said, and nothing came back on the car. Ayala tilted her head slightly, her calm gaze never wavering. She knew her car was properly registered. She knew her plates were valid. And as the state attorney, a person whose job was to uphold and enforce the law, she knew that running plates without cause and then using it as justification for a stop was, at best, suspicious. Still, she kept her composure. "Is that the only reason?" she asked, her tone even but firm. The officers hesitated again. One mumbled something about routine checks, but their explanation wasn't adding up. Anyone watching could feel the tension building, like a rubber band stretched too far. And here's the part that really makes you think. Imagine if she wasn't the state attorney. Imagine if she didn't have the authority, the knowledge of the law, or even the presence of mind to question them so calmly. How many other drivers would have just accepted that weak explanation, frustrated but powerless to challenge it? But Ayala wasn't just any driver. She represented thousands of people in her community, people who trusted her to fight for justice every single day. And in that moment, sitting behind the wheel of her car with two armed officers standing over her, she realized something painfully clear. If this could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. The exchange might have seemed small on the surface, a routine stop, as the officers would later try to frame it. But from the very first moment those lights flashed in her mirror, it was obvious that this was about more than a traffic stop. It was about power. It was about perception. And it was about the uncomfortable reality that sometimes simply existing while black can make you a target. And as Ayala sat there, waiting for an answer that made sense, the story was just getting started. The moment Aramis Ayala asked the officers, "What's the reason I was stopped?" was the moment the entire traffic stop began to unravel. The officer's first explanation was shaky at best. "We ran your plates, and nothing came back on the car." To most people, that might sound like a valid reason, at least for a moment. But Ayala wasn't most people. As Florida State Attorney, she knew the system inside and out. She knew that when police run a license plate, they almost always get results instantly. A car's registration status, the owner's name, and other relevant details typically pop up within seconds. For nothing to come back on her vehicle was highly unlikely. Still calm, she pressed further. "So, what exactly do you mean by nothing came back?" The officer stumbled. His partner looked away briefly, avoiding her gaze. Then came an attempt to elaborate. "You know, sometimes the system doesn't return information right away. We just want to make sure everything was okay." But Ayala wasn't buying it. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her questions alone exposed how flimsy their explanation really was. Running plates is routine for law enforcement, but stopping someone solely because of a glitch is unusual, and in many cases questionable. And that's when something clicked for her, and maybe for anyone watching this later, was this really about the plates? Or was this about who was behind the wheel? Ayala had heard countless stories from residents in her community who said they were pulled over for vague reasons. A broken taillight that wasn't actually broken, a lane change without signaling they swore never happened, or like this, some kind of mysterious system issue. These reasons often sounded thin because they were thin, and they often served as a pretext for something else, a way to stop someone without real cause. So, she asked again, a bit more pointedly now, is there any other reason for the stop? Another pause. Another glance exchanged between the officers. One of them mentioned they were also checking tinted windows. It was almost like they were grasping at straws, trying to come up with something, anything that might sound legitimate. But Ayala's car met all legal requirements. Nothing about it was out of the ordinary. And deep down, she already knew the truth. This wasn't about the car at all. Here's the thing. A traffic stop can change everything in an instant. For many people, especially black drivers, even a routine stop can escalate unpredictably. Ayala was fully aware of this. Despite her position of authority, she approached every moment carefully, speaking clearly, keeping her hands visible, and making sure her words were measured. She wasn't just thinking about herself. She was thinking about all the people who never got the chance to ask the same question she was asking now. And the more the officers struggled to justify their actions, the clearer the bigger picture became. This wasn't simply a misunderstanding. This was a window into a pattern where certain people are seen as suspicious first, and everything else is figured out later. By the end of their awkward explanations, Ayala had gotten no real answer at all. The officers had revealed more in what they couldn't say than in what they did. It left her, and soon the entire public, with one haunting question. If they didn't know who she was, what might have happened next? Up to this point, the traffic stop had been a balancing act. Two officers fumbling for a reason to justify pulling someone over, and one calm, composed driver asking questions they couldn't answer. But then came the moment that flipped the entire interaction on its head. One of the officers, perhaps out of curiosity, or maybe because he sensed something unusual about how confidently she was speaking, finally asked, "What agency are you with?" Without hesitation, she answered, "I'm the state attorney." Silence. For a few seconds, it was as if time stopped. The same officers who had seemed so certain of their authority moments ago suddenly looked unsettled. Their posture shifted. Their tone softened. And it was all captured in that split-second reaction. The kind of reaction you only see when someone realizes they've just made a very big mistake. You could almost read their thoughts. The state attorney? The person in charge of prosecuting cases in this entire district? The dynamic of the encounter changed instantly. Up until that point, Ayala had been treated like any other driver. Actually, worse than that, like a suspicious driver who needed to be stopped and questioned for no clear reason. But now, the officers were face to face with someone they not only recognized as a professional peer, but someone who held power over the very system they worked in. Their voices grew more polite, almost deferential. One officer tried to backpedal. "We're just doing routine checks, ma'am. Nothing personal." Another added, "We didn't realize who you were." And there it was, the accidental admission that revealed the truth. Because if they had known who she was, would this stop have even happened? Ayala didn't lash out. She didn't raise her voice or would try to humiliate them. Instead, she stayed exactly as she had been from the start. Calm, measured, and professional. But her response carried weight. "That's exactly the problem," she said evenly. "It shouldn't matter who I am." And she was right. Think about that for a moment. The only thing that changed in this stop was their knowledge of her identity. Her car hadn't magically become more legal. Her windows hadn't suddenly become less tinted. Her license plate hadn't transformed from nothing came back to fully valid in those few seconds. The only thing that shifted was their perception of her value and authority. That's what made this moment so powerful and so unsettling. Because if she hadn't been the state attorney, if she had been just another black driver going about their day, how would this story have ended? Would they have continued pressing her? Would they have searched her car? Would they have written her a ticket for something made up on the spot? Or worse, Her position protected her in ways that millions of people do not get to experience. And Ayala understood that deeply. As the officers scrambled to explain themselves, she wasn't thinking just about her own safety. She was thinking about the bigger message this sent to the people she served. Justice in America too often depends on who you are and who people think you are. By the time the stop ended, the officers had shifted entirely to damage control mode, offering nervous smiles and polite goodbyes. But the impression they left behind wasn't going away. What they had revealed, without even realizing it, was something far bigger than a traffic stop. They had revealed how fragile the line is between authority and abuse of power, and how quickly that line can move when status enters the equation. By the time Aramis Ayala drove away from that stop, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. What had just happened wasn't simply an inconvenience. It was a moment that revealed something much deeper about how power and perception collide on America's streets. And then the video surfaced. Someone had recorded the encounter, a raw, unfiltered glimpse of what it looks like when authority gets questioned by someone who actually knows the law better than the officers enforcing it. The clip spread fast, first locally, then nationally. People didn't just watch it. They replayed it. They dissected it. They asked the same question Ayala had asked that night. What was the real reason for this stop? For some viewers, especially those who had experienced similar traffic stops, the video was painfully familiar. They saw in Ayala's calm, but insistent questioning the same quiet frustration they'd felt when they'd been told things like broken taillight or routine check, even when nothing was wrong with their cars. Others, who had never been stopped like this before, were shocked. If the highest-ranking prosecutor in the region could be treated this way, what hope did ordinary drivers have? And then came the broader debate. Law enforcement representatives tried to downplay the incident. They said the officers hadn't done anything illegal. They called it standard procedure and insisted there was no racial bias involved. But that explanation rang hollow for many people. Because whether or not the stop followed policy, the bigger issue was what it revealed about how policy can be used as a shield for behavior that feels deeply unfair. Ayala herself chose her words carefully when she addressed the public. She didn't call for the officers to be punished. She didn't make it personal. Instead, she focused on principles, transparency, accountability, and the need to rebuild trust between communities and the police. Trust is fragile, she said in one interview. It's earned through fairness, and it's lost through experiences like this. Her response drew praise from many who admired her professionalism, but it also sparked criticism from people who felt she should have done more to call out the officers. That tension between pushing for change and keeping the conversation constructive became part of the larger narrative. Meanwhile, activists seized on the video as proof of what they'd been saying for years. That racial profiling isn't an isolated problem. It's systemic. It happens to everyday people, and the only reason this incident got attention was because the driver happened to be someone powerful enough to make people listen. The story even reached national news outlets, where commentators debated what routine really means. Some pointed out how routine for police often feels like harassment for drivers of color. Others questioned why running plates without probable cause should even be allowed. The stop, brief as it was, became a catalyst for a much bigger conversation about race, power, and accountability in America. For Ayala, the lesson was clear. The incident wasn't just about her. It was about using her platform to shed light on experiences that rarely get recorded, let alone addressed. She reminded people that real change doesn't come from viral moments. It comes from policies that ensure fairness for everyone, no matter who they are or what they look like. And so, what started as a minor traffic stop had snowballed into something far greater, a national reckoning, sparked by a single, uncomfortable question that still hung in the air. What was the real reason for the stop? By the time the dust settled, Aramis Ayala's traffic stop had become more than just an isolated incident. It had become a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about how justice is experienced differently depending on who you are, where you're from, and even what you look like. But to fully understand why this story struck such a chord, You have to unpack what it revealed step by step. First, let's consider the obvious. Nothing illegal happened in that traffic stop. The officers didn't threaten her. They didn't use force. They didn't even issue a ticket. On paper, it was uneventful. But that's precisely the problem. If a stop with no violence and no shouting can still feel wrong, still feel loaded with bias, what does that say about the system that allows it to happen? For Ayala, that question wasn't abstract. It was personal. She had spent her career believing in the power of the law to create fairness. She had fought to hold people accountable, including police officers, when they abused their power. Yet, sitting in her car that evening, she felt the same vulnerability that so many in her community had described to her over the years. And here's where it gets even deeper. The stop only became safe once the officers realized who she was. Until that moment, she was just another black driver at the mercy of whatever narrative they decided to create about her. When they learned she was a state attorney, the power dynamic flipped. Suddenly, she wasn't a suspect anymore. She was someone who mattered in their eyes. But that's not how justice is supposed to work. Justice is supposed to be blind. It's supposed to treat everyone equally, regardless of status, profession, or race. And that's why Ayala's calm response hit so hard. It shouldn't matter who I am. That single sentence summed up everything wrong with the encounter, and everything wrong with the larger system represented. After the video went viral, many people said they felt speechless watching it. Not because it was dramatic or shocking in the usual sense, but because it was so ordinary. Millions of people experience stops like this every year, but they don't make headlines because they don't end with someone saying, "I'm the state attorney." They end with tickets. They end with fines. Sometimes they end with arrests. And sometimes, tragically, they end with violence. Ayala's stop became a chance to talk about all those other stories. The ones that never get recorded, never get explained, never get believed. In interviews, she didn't focus on herself. She focused on solutions, better training for officers, stronger requirements for explaining stops, and policies that limit the use of vague pretexts like plate checks and window tint claims. She emphasized that this wasn't about attacking the police. It was about building a system where trust isn't conditional, where fairness isn't optional. And here's the bigger takeaway, the one that matters for everyone watching this story. This isn't just a Florida problem. It's not even just an American problem. It's a human problem, rooted in the way power can distort judgment and the way bias, whether conscious or unconscious, can shape decisions that affect lives in real time. Ask yourself, if you got pulled over tonight, what story would the officers tell themselves about you before they even reach your window? Would they see you as a threat? As harmless? As someone who belongs? As someone who doesn't? And how much of that story would have nothing to do with who you actually are? That's why this story resonates so deeply. It forces us to confront not just what happened to Aramis Ayala, but what could happen to any of us, or more importantly, what already happens to so many people who never get the chance to ask, what was the reason for the stop? By the end of it all, Ayala turned her experience into a call to action. She reminded the public that real change isn't about one viral video. It's about policies, accountability, and the courage to keep asking hard questions even when the answers are uncomfortable. And maybe that's where this story leaves us. Not with anger, but with clarity. Because once you see how fragile fairness can be, you can't unsee it. Once you realize how much depends on being recognized as someone who matters, you start to understand why so many people keep demanding a system where everyone matters equally. So what happened that night? On the surface, nothing. But in reality, everything. And the next time flashing lights appear in someone's rearview mirror, maybe they'll remember this story. Not because it's about a state attorney, but because it's about all of us.